Lord, I ask that your Spirit would guide Jim as he presents. And Lord, we ask for your guidance in each one of our hearing as well, and in our thinking. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Tim. Pleasure meeting you again. Since I invited you to the Grass Valley Church a long time ago, and you did an excellent job. I often accused by my wife of being long-winded, and that's because I'm an attorney and I'm usually paid by the word. But I have no delusions that I will not get through my material today, because I've never spoken under 20 minutes. What I would like to do is, with the help of the red letter Interlinear interpretation of Daniel, and the very first chart you have, which should be on a map, but I didn't want to search for the image in my computer. This is the map of Daniel 11. I will walk you through what I think are 5 transition points in Daniel 11, which are vitally important to get right to understand the book. I have asked Conrad to post my extended notes on the website, and I'll make some editorial corrections before you do, so that if we don't get through the material, you can see what I'm about to say or would have said. The first significant transition point is Daniel 11, verse 16. You can see that on the handout or in your book of Daniel, chapter 11, verse 16. I would read that just quickly. He that comes against him shall do according to his will, and none shall be able to stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious holy land, which by his hand shall be consumed. This is a very important verse, and unless we get it right, get the history right in this verse, I don't think we have a chance of understanding the rest of Daniel, chapter 11. So I'll spend a lot of time going through the history of this verse, and I will have to sacrifice discussions on other transition points if I do that. But I think I will be able to clarify a number of issues by looking at Daniel 16 in somewhat historical detail. The very first and important question to ask yourself in interpreting any passage in an outline prophecy is, what is the time frame of the passage? That helps us identify the actors involved. The time frame of, and I have to go quickly, and I'm sorry. The time frame of verse 16 is found in verses 13 and 14, which tells us that the king of the north, Antiochus III, returns in 2001 BC to attack the king of the south, Egypt. However, this time the king of the north brings allies with him, the many that will come against the king of the south, in verse 14. Among these allies were generals from Hannibal of Carthage, against whom the Romans were at that time waging the Second Punic War. Very important thing to remember. And Philip of Macedonia, and perhaps of Greece. These were Antiochus III's allies. Notice the reference in verse 14, and please follow me from the scriptures or the red interlinear, because it's very important to match the prophecy and the phrase with the history. Notice the words, a reference to his chosen people in verse 15, who would not much help to the king of the south against Antiochus and his allies. This phrase was a reference to Rome. Before he died, Ptolemy V had requested the Senate of Rome to become the guardian of the boy king, Ptolemy V. But engaged in the Second Punic War with Hannibal, Rome was not able to send adequate forces to assist the king of the south in 201 BC. Rome sent its ablest general, Scopas, but he was beaten at the Jordan River by Antiochus I, and again in Sidon, one of the most fenced cities, and he was starved into submission. Now, notice something very significant, which has a very important bearing on verse 40. The focal point of verse 16 is no longer the perennial conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south. That fades into insignificance, and the twin focal points from verse 16 on becomes the relationship between Rome and the king of the north, for a brief while, and Rome and the Jews, God's people, and the conflict that would arise between Rome and God's people. You see, when Antiochus III, king of the north, declared war on the king of the south in 201, they were not engaged in yet another petty battle with the king of the south. They virtually declared war on Rome because Rome had formed a treaty of alliance with Egypt. When the Punic War ended in 2001, the Romans sent Scipio Africanus to deal with the king of the north because Hannibal had fled to Antiochus III for refuge. This is why in verse 16, Roman is introduced as he that comes against him, Antiochus III, the subject of verses 13 and 14, attacking the king of the south, will do according to his will. This phrase, found in chapter 8, 1-9, 3 times, at least twice, and in Daniel 11, 4, verse 4, and then again verse 36, always introduces a new power. The new power does with the former power according to its own will. The second important question to ask is, what is the ending time frame of the verse or passage we are discussing? Here, in verse 16, the beginning time frame is 201 BC. But that is not the ending time frame. And this leads to a lot of confusion when it comes to verse 17 and 23. You see, the middle phrase, none shall stand before him, follow me in verse 16 now, the middle phrase, none shall stand before him, constitutes an unfolding time frame. History is moving on. And although Christ, who gave the prophecy, is not going to go into details now, we must understand the history contained in the verse to follow what Christ is saying in that verse and in succeeding verses. So as history unfolds and the time frame shifts, we find that it incorporates battles between Rome and Antiochus III, in which by 188 BC, Rome defeats Antiochus III, forces Hannibal to take poison, and forms the peace between Egypt, king of the south, and king of the north. Time moves on. Rome defeats and conquers the allies of the king of the north, Macedonia in 168, and Greece in 146. Rome is now master of the eastern Mediterranean. It had become master of the Western Mediterranean when it defeated Hannibal of Carthage. But verse 16 incorporates even more history. Meanwhile, you see, in 188, when Antiochus was beaten, he sent his son, Antiochus IV, as a hostage to Rome to keep the peace. Antiochus IV came to the throne in 175 BC, and by 168, he began to challenge the might of Rome by invading the king of the south, Egypt. But he was humiliated and forced to turn back by threat from Roman's envoy in Egypt. On his way north, in 168, Antiochus beats up on the Jews, desecrates the temple, and tries to extinguish their religion. The Maccabees revolted in 164, and in 161 BC, they form a league of mutual defense with the Romans to protect them from the king of the north. All of this is contained in verse 16, but not particularly articulated by Christ because he's moving fast through history, but he will come back to it. Mark this well. When Rome defeated and conquered, well, let me back up. Let's move on with history. This league with Rome in 161 will soon become a casualty of Rome's growing supremacy against the king of the north. Sulla, the dictator of Rome, inflicted a crushing blow on the king of the north in 88 BC. And in 63 BC, his lieutenant, Pompey the Great, conquers the king of the north. And then absorbs that territory, portions of the western portions of the king of North's territory in Rome. Mark this well. When Rome conquered Macedonia, it did not become the king of Macedonia. When Rome conquered Greece in 146, it did not come king of Greece. When Rome conquered the king of the north by 63, it did not become the king of the north. When Rome conquered Gaul, Spain, England, and other countries, it did not become the king of those countries. Carving out an exception in the military history of Rome by making Rome the king of the north simply because it defeated the Seleucids derives from the pagan philosopher Porphyry's attempts to discredit the book of Daniel in 270 AD as a prophetic message by making Daniel chapter 11, verse 16, and on to verse 45, all about the king of the north. Much of the evangelical world have bought into this allegorical bill of goods from Porphyry, who was a pagan philosopher who tried to stop the march of the Pentecost. Both preterism and futurism have their anchor that Daniel 11:16 onward is allegory. They do this to write Christ and the papacy out of the book of Daniel, particularly chapter 11. We must make a decided break with the mesmerizing relationship with Porphyry and his disciples Origen and Augustine. From verse 16 to 45, the city of Rome, in all its phases, as a country ruling from the west of the king of the north, king of the south, is the subject of the prophecy of Daniel 11. Making Rome, in any of its phases, either the king of the north or the heir of the king of the north, adds nothing but confusion and opens the door to to allegorical subjective thinking for the rest of the prophecy from verse 16 to 45. Especially this attained to our interpretations of verses 36 and 40 to 45. I don't think this is this is a non-negotiable point for historicism. However, we have not yet exhausted the history incorporated in verse 16. Pompey the Great, disregarding the league of friendship that the Jews had formed with Rome in 161, by conquering that country in 63 BC and demolishing the temple, is referred to in verse 16 by the phrase, he shall stand in the Holy Land. Okay? So the history starts in 201 BC, and by the time it comes to the second last phrase of 16, he shall stand in the Holy Land. That is, Rome shall stand in the Holy Land. That is Pompey conquering Jerusalem and demolishing the temple. But it goes on to say, which by his hand shall be consumed. Pompey's conquest and inadvertent burning of the temple does not encompass the magnitude of this phrase, it shall be consumed. Pompey did not consume the Holy Land. The burning of the temple was inadvertent. So the ending time frame, I believe what Christ did is that from Pompey's attack on Jerusalem, Christ, who is given the prophecy, looks another 100 years into the future, from 63 BC, to see AD 70, and then AD 135, when first Titus destroys the temple and Jerusalem, and then Hadrian repeats that and banishes the Jews. Christ looks into the future and he sees those events because when he would be a man walking on this earth, in Luke 21:24, he will talk about this very subject, the fate of Rome at the hands of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans. So the ending time frame of verse 16, and this is extremely important, the ending time frame of verse 16 is 70 AD or 135 AD. Some of you note in your position papers that historicism requires a linear fulfillment of historical prophecy in an outline, history in an outline prophecy. I respectively disagree. The prophecies of Daniel, chapter 7a, the prophecies of Revelation, the prophecies of Matthew 24, the prophecies of Luke 21, has many examples of doubling back. This doubling back is demonstrated in verse 17, where Christ goes back and he tries to explain Julius Caesar's conquest of Egypt, which was incorporated in verse 16, but he didn't have time to explain. And he follows that line of thinking to verse 22 because he follows the heads after Caesar and Octavius and Tiberius to the crucifixion of Christ. And then Christ in verse 23, because he had not yet finished talking about Rome's double crossing of the Jews in that Treaty of 168, in verse 23, he goes back in time again to look at that league and how they would the Romans will betray the Jews, verse 23. And in verse 28, he shows how Rome will consume the Holy Land and be against the Holy Covenant. And then, I know my time is up. What Christ does now in verses 24 to 28, or 28, he looks at Rome's subjugation and absorption of the territory of the king of the south, because he had hinted to it but had never developed it. So he develops it in verses 24 to 28. Thank you. I shall have to try and get in these other things during discussion time some other time. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Brother Jim.